Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. A few weeks ago, I had the privilege of welcoming Dr. Andrea Balis and Elizabeth Levy to discuss their recent book, Witch Hunt, The Cold War, Joe McCarthy, and the Red Scare. Dr. Andrea Balis is a historian at the John Jay College, City University of New York. She specializes in 20th century political history and is the author of 2 books geared for younger audiences. Elizabeth Levy is an award-winning author of over 100 fiction and nonfiction books for children and young adults. She has worked with renowned historians in developing the books America's Funny But True History and If You Were There When They Signed the Constitution. We held our conversation over Zoom, so I'm inserting my standard sound quality warning here. I hope you all enjoy the interview. Hello, friends. Welcome back. I am doing something a little different today in that I am being joined by not one, but 2 guests, Andrea Balis and Elizabeth Levy. They are the authors behind the book Witch Hunt, The Cold War, Joe McCarthy, and the Red Scare, which tells the dramatic, compelling story of the Cold War in an engaging new format, which will be the topic of our conversation today. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
All right, so let's dive on in. For those who may not be aware or fully understand, what exactly was the Red Scare?
Andrea, as an historian, why don't you take it?
In the period after World War II, as the Soviet Union started marching across Europe and incorporating countries into what became the Soviet Union, the world seemed divided between communism and capitalism, and that's how people saw it on both sides. So the Red Scare is the fear that people had in the United States and other European countries that that there were communist agents in the United States trying to find out America's secrets, because we were in this state of tension, perpetual tension. And it was called the Cold War because theoretically it wasn't a shooting war, although there were plenty of proxy wars, but it was nevertheless this acknowledged antagonism.
Yeah. And the irony was that although the Soviet Union did have spies, they very rarely picked intellectuals who had been drawn to truly not just the Communist Party, but literally parties. During the Depression, when so many people were out of work, a lot of people felt there could be a more fair way of doing it. So people joined associations and unions. These were not who the Soviet Union recruited as spies, but these were the people who various people in different governments became obsessed with getting out and showing who they were.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was it is intended for a younger audience, and it's really written in kind of an accessible way. So what inspired you to write this book about the Cold War, specifically geared to a younger audience?
Well, Andrea and I had done theater in the 1970s. So this is for people who can't see the book, it's almost like a script, or as kids think, it's Twitter, because we separate the narrator from the quotes. It's now being used a lot, obviously, by Bridgerton or, even on TikTok, narrator voices. But it's a voice that made it comfortable for us because it wasn't huge chunks of paragraphs. And then we could find the quotes where the people themselves could actually tell the story. So it wasn't necessarily that it was for young people, though I had always been writing for young people, it really felt like a wonderful way to tell the story.
And I had been teaching history in a college as part of the City University of New York. And what I was really aware of was that many of these pieces of 20th century history that are pretty critical somehow is being skipped in their education, and that people were arriving well, among other things, not knowing who was on which side of World War II. But and these are, it's not a question of wanting to impose I think a certain view of history as much as it is being able to recognize the landmarks that that we all use to talk in common about things, so that my students couldn't talk about communism versus capitalism, which is now a topic for people, because they didn't know what capitalism was or communism was, and they didn't know that there had been this 50-year conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that had been the spine of world politics.
Yeah. Well, and I think you mentioned kind of incorporating the quotes that you really wanted to kind of infuse and enhance your storytelling. And I thought, based on how this was written, it, like I said, very accessible, very easy to read. And so my question is, how and why did you choose to incorporate the primary sources that you used in the book?
Well, we have pretty strong thoughts about primary sources. I mean, you know, we think the question of primary sources is really important. As a historian, I spent my graduate school training looking at primary sources, and it made me suspicious. And in the course of this, we looked for these primary sources. We wanted to share the words of the people themselves, but we were also looking for the things that were missing, the things that were omitted, and the things that weren't true, that were part of the historical record.
And they're lively. When you either interview or find them when you're looking for them, you really do feel like a magpie swooping down and finding something that really excites you. And that doesn't come just from reading secondary sources. It's finding that, you know, Joe McCarthy really believed that if he ate a stick of butter, it would coat his stomach and could be an alcoholic. Now, no, you don't need to know that for history, but it certainly is fun to know. And so I encourage anyone reading history to find those pieces that excite you, because that will make it come alive.
As a teacher, it's the only thing my students ever remembered in teaching classes were the weird things that I would, sort of mention. Did you know Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers? I mean, that people remembered, because we do. Yeah. We remember.
Yeah, I think, all the anecdotes and the quotes really help humanize these people from the past, right? And I think that's when you start to get more engagement from students and from maybe people who are not quote unquote historians. It's you kind of bring them down to a human level. The butter quote was great. I chuckled at that one.
But it is all human. I mean, one reason we somewhat got excited when we found that they tried to ban Robin Hood because he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And the other about the book is that people find a way to get over their fear. So kids in Indiana, I'll let Andrea take it because it's her favorite feathers. Go, Andrea, take the feathers.
This is my favorite story. When we found that, we were stunned to discover that Robin Hood was banned. And so apparently were the students in Indiana who really loved Robin Hood. And so they went to a chicken farm nearby, and they gathered up a lot of chicken feathers, which you can gather up a lot of chicken feathers, like, and stuff them in one bag. And they dyed them all green in honor of Robin Hood's little hat. And then they threw them off the balcony of the Indiana State Legislature. That's the kind of political action you've got to love. And, and the Green Feather Society is the kind of organization. It may not be major, but it sure sticks in your mind.
Yep.
And the other is that they were afraid when the FBI came. So I think also when you go to primary sources, it doesn't become this monolith of these brave students who weren't afraid. No, when the FBI came to investigate them, they were scared. So I think, and when you find those quotes where the kids said, and they were college students, they weren't even kids, say that I was afraid when the FBI came to my home, that also brings it down to what Andrea often calls collateral damage, to the real people. We're all in history.
And they had a reason to be nervous when the FBI appeared on campus, in a way that it's important to understand now, that dropping green feathers brought the FBI in. I mean, they were out there making sure Robin Hood did not infiltrate.
Yeah, very, very compelling and interesting anecdote. And you had mentioned before in a previous answer that you had both have theater backgrounds in the 70s. And so I think, one thing that I picked up on very early on in the book is that this really lent its way to kind of a creative reenactment of how events occurred. And so was it just the theater background that was the inspiration, or was there more to kind of the idea in putting together this story in such a creative, accessibly creative format?
Well, unfortunately, as two authors, you'd wish one had a strength and the other had a different one, but we both have actually the same kind of mind that gets very excited and then can't stay with it. But this really helped us because we could try to find the quotes that tell the story. And we love to go into schools and have kids. It is reenactable, and we can have kids as young as fifth graders, because we can give them the script and they also get to be the fly on the wall, which we also was a great relief for us when we found this narrator voice. So yes, we can have kids, and we can encourage kids and students to do their own, like fly on the wall, interview people about a little piece of history that you're interested, and write a little script of that. Then you won't get so bogged down that I can't do this.
The thing about learning history is that you have to know a lot of history to learn history. If you know a lot, right, you're plugging new facts into a structure you already have. It's like having a walk-in closet with no rods or shelves or drawers. Everything is in there, but you'll never find it. So, I mean, that's always the problem with learning history, is that you have the context around an event and you want to think about the event, but in order to understand it, you really have to know a lot that's around it. So the fly appeared, and the fly is a fly on the wall to history. We've always all wanted to be a fly on the wall to things. And the fly is able to, because the fly has seen everything and knows everything because of those eyes they have that look in all directions, the fly is able to provide that kind of background so you can relax and just hang out with the voices that are on the page, because the fly will make sure you know what's going on and know the events that were happening around it. So you can just have fun, which is what history ought to be.
Well, you're preaching to the converted. I love history and think it's a great time. But yeah, I really loved that, because again, I think it's analysis. There was analysis of the Cold War throughout the book, but it was hidden in plain sight with these quotes and this way to kind of really engage readers. So I really appreciated that. And the other thing that I really kind of sensed was a tie to current times. So how does the analysis of the Cold War help us understand our current moment?
And you take your fair. She's a wonderful teacher, so I'll let her teach what she tells her kids.
History doesn't repeat. That thing that we're told that if you know history, you're safe from, it's not true. If ever there was an example in the world of how we can be surprised, one of the things about history is you don't know what's going to happen next. You don't get to read the next chapter. So the reason that the Native Americans didn't react more violently to the original Pilgrims is they didn't know all those other Pilgrims were coming. They hadn't read that chapter yet. And
they had traded with people they know for hundreds and hundreds of years. They were people who traded. It wasn't that they were so shocked that they were strangers. We find things from, Louisiana and the Michigan shores, the pre-Columbian history. But you also have to realize people don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
You have to have compassion for that, because you can't always be a Monday morning quarterback. With the McCarthy era, Truman and Eisenhower were both pretty good presidents, but they were so afraid of being labeled not strong enough against communism. They did not like McCarthy. McCarthy was sort of a showman. He loved headlines. He would have probably grabbed something if it hadn't been communism. He was a new young senator, uh, pretty brash. But Truman, both and Eisenhower did so many harm to real people's lives by insisting on loyalty oaths, by trying to block McCarthy from calling them soft on communism, that many more people lost their jobs. And they weren't evil people.
And that's why you need to have the fly to remind you that it isn't just what Truman is doing or Eisenhower is doing. It's in the context of this Cold War. It's in the fact that there was a power struggle going on, amazingly, between the Democratic and Republican Party. That all of those things are important to understand, but distractions. So that's why it's so great to have the fly. They can provide you with those things in a tone of voice that doesn't lecture at you.
And we found wonderful quotes and people. There were many returning GIs from, especially in the Europe. So they were Black soldiers who really felt, even though the army was still segregated, that they had fought against the worst racism, and no way would the United States want that here. And they came back quite optimistic that life was going to be different. And they had money for the first time, because you got back pay from the army. And they were lynched and brought with huge resistance. But very quickly, Hoover then began to claim that anybody who was working for civil rights in the late 1940s and 50s was communist inspired. So it worked insidiously for things that you might not have expected. The returning GIs did not expect that, nor had they been influenced by communists. But when they were thrown off buses and blinded, and the NAACP sent them on speaking tours, then they were charged with being communists.
And it's one of those important things about history, that they came back to the United States full of this hope, and they entered the era of Jim Crow. I mean, Jim Crow begins simultaneously, and obviously, they're connected. All of these people who felt they were an optimistic and part of society were being quickly told, actually, no. But all of those things fit together into what happens next, how the United States tries to come to terms with, at this point, the civil rights movement.
And when you ask how it happens, obviously they're trying to ban Robin Hood, but you ask for comparisons today, they're not the same, but they are. It's quite often the people who, honestly, the country doesn't have to be afraid of, teachers and librarians, who get attacked. So there was a wonderful teacher in Massachusetts who was a second grade teacher in the 30s. Yes, she had gone to a communist party, but honestly, some people said, I think my father went to communist parties to meet girls. It wasn't always this intellectual thing. And she dropped it very right away and became a teacher. The FBI came to her school board, and even though she tried to defend herself, she got fired. But that wasn't the end of it. And I'll let Andrea take the end of it.
I always get the end of the story. So she got another job. It wasn't as a teacher. It was sweeping out kennels for the ASPCA. So she was sweeping poop when they found her. The FBI found her and went to the ASPCA and said, you have to fire your poop sweeper because she was a communist. This is a sort of astonishing thing, and it really happened. I mean, I think a lot of these, one of the things that I was surprised about as we worked on this book is how many of these local let's hunt down the communist boards there were, how many committees in every town there were that were busy searching out their local communists, that it infiltrated society to that degree that if you had red curtains, someone was going to report you. I mean, and that's an astonishing level of community participation that's a little unnerving.
And also that people changed their lives often before they were attacked. You're in broadcasting. And we just certainly have a chapter about the Hollywood 10, who were the most famous writers who were accused of being communists and actually went into jail for not contempt of Congress. But one of the people we interviewed, his mother and his father, remember, television had just started. The conventions of 48 were the first ones televised. And his mother was one of the first, like you are, a broadcaster. She was behind the camera, candid camera. Many women weren't. And yet, because they had leftist tendencies in the 30s, now remember, this is the 50s, so this is when they were young. They're now in their 40s and 50s. But they felt they would be fired. And she was one of, a pioneering woman a television person. And we do love the family stories because they bought a farm in Connecticut to try to make a lot of people who were scared of being communists. If you had a farm, you could sell your stuff at this, on the side of the road. And the FBI came to visit them there. And their son, who we interviewed, was scared. He ended up being in film himself. And his father said, "Don't worry, communist chickens don't make headlines. The FBI wants headlines." And he always remembered his father telling him that. So those are the things when we interview people or look for quotes that we look for.
And another piece of the context that we need to provide is that the 1930s were a depression.
Yeah.
And the people were looking for social solutions, and that it was a time of great social upheaval, and that's part of the story also, is how this idea of collateral damage became really important to us, that the people that about, the people who actually were called before the committees, those people's lives were really harmed, but so were their friends, so were their children, so were the people who were called in and asked, "Oh, by the way, do you know any communists? Can you name any names?" That it was the quote, little people, that it was the regular, average, everyday people who this impacted. That you think of historical events as something that touches somewhere them, but this didn't affect them. It affected us. It affected people on the ground. It affected children whose teachers suddenly disappeared. It affected children who went to the library and the librarian disappeared. So as today, the library disappears. So, I mean, these are concerns that we have, but it's important to understand we're all history. We're all part of history. It is the history of us.
Yeah.
And the bigger the us is, the better the story is. And so we were trying to make the us bigger and include all the people that this event touched.
Yeah, that's very well put. The larger the history and the more inclusion, the larger the story. I like that sentiment. And kind of speaking about the people, this book, like we've touched on, had a lot of humanizing little anecdotes, such as the butter story, which is still, I think, one of my favorites.
Thank you.
And so,
by the way, it doesn't work. We should just make it really clear. This is not a scientific study. This is not proof.
And so, kind of touching on that even more, there had to have been a detail or two that maybe you had to cut, even though you really, really enjoyed it. So were there any kind of humanizing details that you want to share with us that just couldn't make it into the book?
A lot, because and sometimes, and I want people or listeners to remember, historians aren't perfect either. Sometimes as we were writing, we might have interviewed somebody and thought this would be terrific. They really remembered a moment in high school, even though they came from an upper class. I remember somebody we interviewed, so they felt so protected. What could happen? I'm at an upper class private school. And suddenly the fear of various friends of hers being afraid. And then there's things that we just fight about because I can't help it, Andrea. Can I bring Senator Potter?
All right. We thought about this one. Go ahead.
McCarthy was brought down. It really had nothing to do with communism. It was his aide, Roy Cohn, who became Trump's lawyer, and really honestly believed if you kept denying and lying enough, people would go away.
He has some evidence to back that up.
He didn't want this young aide that he had found, David Shine, to have to go in the army and peel potatoes. And then he decided, when he tried to threaten Eisenhower's generals, Andrea, you should take how Eisenhower takes to be having his generals threatened.
Not so much. This is a man who had managed to get all the generals to work together on the Allied side during World War II. He was used to being able to coordinate things with lots of strong egos, but he felt really strongly, nevertheless, that generals were generals, and you did not interfere with generals. So this decision on the part of Roy Cohn that generals really, that were people he could kick around, was not going to go over really well with the head of the Allied military world.
And Eisenhower started to tell his generals and the people who worked for them, keep me a list. Start writing down every threat that Roy Cohn makes. And so they had a record. And Roy Cohn wanted to lie about it and deny that he had ever said that. And a senator who had both his legs shot off during World War II, that's so Andrew.
This is the part I wouldn't let her put in the book.
He went to McCarthy to tell him that he had to fire Roy Cohn because, you senators are in charge of their aides. And he did have the paper in his mouth, but Andrea said I could not put that in. But
you're leaving out why he had the paper in his mouth.
Because he could add no legs.
Yeah. So
the people who can't read, I'm sort of demonstrating, but anyhow, that was a little detail that was one too many. So we had a lot of those, but some are really just you tell the story and then you forgot you had something there. That's okay, because you're telling the story that you have. You can't really regret too much what you can't get in, as long as the story begins to feel right.
But that choosing of what goes in and what stays out, of course, is really important. And this is one of the major points that we keep bringing up all the time. It goes back to this question about primary sources. What's preserved? What is the historical record? What are we keeping? We now have this vast amount of information, all the Twitters in the world, all the emails. Well, it's obviously too much now. So what's going to be kept? What's going to be, who decides what's going to be kept? When I was in graduate school, the field of women's history was still a young field. And one of the things that caused the fact that there was so little written was that people said there are no sources about women. And that's because they aren't in the congressional record or the equivalent. But they're there. And the finding of them and the choosing of which we should include, that's that is history. That is the historical record. And we want our readers to understand that leaving things out, omissions in the historical record, they count forward for hundreds of years. I mean, we historians say the people who control the writing of history control the past. And it's true. And we want our readers to understand it's imperfectly written.
And also it's imperfectly sourced because, yes, we have 352 footnotes with children's books we didn't used to have. But people lie. Just because it's footnoted doesn't mean it's the truth. You're telling the lies that some people told. And then that's what our fly on the wall, and we try to put that context. But I think that's very hard for all people writing history to remember, that just because you footnote something and now you can find it so quickly, as our copy
people
often
lie.
did.
They lie. We all lie. What makes you think
And it's all right to put the people's lies in, as long as you have somebody like the Fly to remind them that this really didn't happen. That Roy Cohn stayed up all night pretending that he had never, that whatever calls he made to the generals was about a communist in a fort in New Jersey, not about trying to get his young man out of, potato peeling.
And who of us hasn't sat up all night trying to recreate evidence for an argument that we're making, and we make stuff up? We know we do. We know. Well, why would you think that other people don't? Why, of all people in the world who wouldn't make stuff up and add it to historical record, Roy Cohn? I mean, really, that just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And so we're kind of talking about some takeaways that you want readers to get. So let's expand on this a little bit. What do you hope people take away from your book?
The history is gossip about dead people. And therefore, it's fun and interesting to read, just like People magazine is.
And that being afraid, and it isn't always the answer, but being afraid is not always the reason you don't do something. Because what was very touching about the teachers and writers, and kids of teachers and writers, although they realized they perhaps was somewhat damaged by how their parents made less money, were so much of their life was taken off of it, they were also proud of their parents. They were often some of the Hollywood people, especially actors, because remember, writers can write under a different name. In fact, ironically, one of the writers ended up writing Robin Hood stories in London, Lee Lardner Jr. But an actor like Zero Mostel or Lucille Ball got away with it, and Jack Guilford, you can't change your face. So if you're a Harry Belafonte, if you're on a blacklist, you may not get able to work. But they were still not sorry that they didn't name other names, and they remembered the ones who did.
History is also made up of all these anonymous acts of bravery. And we see them around us all the time, right? We saw them in the people who distributed cold water to the people who were standing in line to vote, and it was illegal to do that. I mean, those are in the collecting of the historical record. The people who handed out water they're not going to be the historical heroes. But in fact, if it weren't for these everyday acts of heroism or courage or just being, we wouldn't have a historical record. We wouldn't have history. Wouldn't be.
Yes, I like that. Well put. And so where can people go when they've finished your book and you have opened up a historical rabbit hole for them and they want to learn more? Where should they go?
Well, first they can, my website, ElizabethLevy.com, has a way that you can write me. Andrea does too, but because I've been writing children's books a long time, and Andrea's had fend off various students. Please, Dr. Balis, can I do it? So you can certainly write to us and we'll give you more material. There's wonderful material that's there, and a way that you could perhaps write about how the Cold War affected your community. Because it's interesting, wonderful stories and playlets that you could do. I mean, I'm a judge on the National History Contest for kids from sixth grade to 10th and then 10th to 12th, and they do fabulous work. So, history, because it's a story, people are still loving to research and put it together in a way that makes sense to them.
Because it's still being written. In the end, the story of the Cold War, it's not just the events that happened in the 50s. It's all of the repercussions. It's all of those collateral effects. It's all of the things around it that are still happening. We still hear all of these references to communism and these the name calling about communism. This is where it comes from.
But the Soviet Union hasn't been communist for nearly 30 years.
The Soviet Union doesn't even exist.
No.
And yet that the heritage of the Soviet Union, the heritage of the Cold War, is still present. So it's historical events don't end at a certain point, because the things that happen afterwards, the way they're used, the connections that are built, which are changing all the time, are part of the event. And what McCarthyism is will look really different 50 years from now, because it will be different 50 years from now. The things that are the results of McCarthyism, there'll be more of them. There'll be changes that happen that make the fact is it's still alive. It's still with us.
And that people who come out of it, I mean, one of the parts that I didn't know about was the lavender scare, was how many, and this actually happened late in McCarthyism, and not from McCarthy, but from Eisenhower, again, trying to prove he was more anti-communist than McCarthy. And so he allowed a purge of the State Department and the armed forces of anyone who was even suspected. Now, they never found anyone who was blackmailed. Literally never. But
we didn't have any Vietnamese speakers in the State Department when the war in Vietnam began, because they had all been purged.
And there was a woman who would have been the first brigadier general in the Air Force, who was afraid to take her promotion in the 50s because she was worried that she would be outed as being gay. It would come out to her family. So she didn't take that promotion. But yet out of that came somebody in the State Department who really started, in some ways, the gay rights movement. So, and just as in broadcasting, Murrow, looking for a really good story, found a tiny little story in the Detroit newspaper about an American with a Serbian father who had been in the Air Force and was being told to leave the Air Force quietly because his father took a Serbian newspaper and that could be communist. And he refused to. And that was the first television program that was sort of anti-McCarthyism. So these things have little tentacles that you don't know where they're coming out of, and where that sort of story that takes over.
And McCarthyism can be seen as a story of a struggle for power in the Republican Party. And I mean, what brought McCarthy down in other ways is he started attacking Republicans, and the Republican Party had been shielding him. But once he started going after other Republicans, not so much. And so on another level, it's a story about party politics that certainly rings familiar to us. So,
and it changed so quickly. That's, I think, what also Andrew says. You don't know in history what's going to happen. He truly was in power, and the Army McCarthy hearings got televised and brought him down quicker than you could possibly believe.
And Elizabeth, I know you mentioned you had a website. Dr. Balis, do you have a place where people can go and find out more about your scholarship?
My website will be live soon. It'll go live soon. At the back in the book, we have for further reading. I mean, we do have some suggestions about books. This is certainly an area where there has been a lot of scholarship and a lot of very controversial scholarship.
And we talk every day. We're doing another book. And so anything that anyone writes me, I'll throw over to Andrea and we'll write them back.
Wonderful. All right. Now, before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your day, is there anything we haven't covered today that you want future readers to know?
Yes, to realize that you're going through history, whatever age you are, that you're reading this or interested. Do not think that your present isn't past for your kids, for you, and especially for people who are really interested, you can get these details yourself. There are people really do like to tell their stories, and do not be, just as you're doing for civics and coffee. What could be more fun, except if we had wine? But we're on the East Coast, so we're closer to wine than
we're young adult writers, Liz.
If you read something and find it really interesting this period, which I hope you will when you read this book, and you can now get it. The nice thing about it is it got, which all my books do not, but it got very starred reviews, and so most libraries now have it already. And of course you can buy it.
And we encourage you to do so.
Both. But the exciting thing is, as you're doing in your podcast, to just remember that history, and that sounds like such a cliche that it's fun, but it honestly is.
And we live in a time, it happens, of some pretty interesting public history that's being written. I mean, we live in and this is a tense moment in history. And there are a lot of people, a lot of historians who are writing about it and trying to give other people a sense of the historical continuity of this, so that people see that where they fit into an ongoing story. And history's not done. I mean, history isn't something that happened back in the day and is over. History is yesterday. History is the beginning of this interview. So it's happening around us. We're all part of it. We're all participating in it.
And don't be bored by it. I mean, Andrea laughs, but I think it's probably became a writer. It never occurred to me that my professors weren't excited to get my papers.
As a professor, I have another point of view.
But I really always, and it sometimes drove my friends who were philosophy majors, I would find these little details that I found fun. And I knew no matter what the essay was, I was going to get it in. I knew that Alexander Hamilton had a graceful turn of the leg, was going to come into so many.
Come on, everybody thinks Alexander Hamilton's hot. I mean, this is not
when I was writing about it.
Yeah.
It was on the $10 bill.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's exactly how I got through college, and then through my writing, whether I write history, fiction, or nonfiction. It's finding what I find juicy.
And history is nothing if not juicy.
That's
right. Gossip about dead people.
And when you find yourself being bored by what you're writing, believe me, your reader will be bored.
Yeah. I love that. Well, I can guarantee the listeners out there, if you pick up Witch Hunt, it will not be boring. It is very effectively written. Please make sure you go and get yourself a copy. It is an engaging new way to learn about the Cold War, and you will not be disappointed. Thank you again, ladies, for taking your time to spend with me. I really appreciated having you on.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And there you have it, folks. If you have any young readers in your household, I'd highly recommend picking up Witch Hunt. It is a fast-paced, interesting take on the Cold War and is very accessible for audiences of all ages. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.